Good morning or afternoon, whatever time zone you may be in. My name is Sarah Seeloff. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLR, and we're so happy to have you with us today for our webinar, New Riffs on TIFs, Lessons in Innovative Financing from Detroit. This is a real treat. Glad to have you with us. A couple of housekeeping items. You can download presentation materials by clicking on the console to the right of the screen. We will have recordings available afterward. We'll do questions at the end. So please, throughout the broadcast, you can enter the questions into the console at the right of the screen. We'll answer them once the presentation's done. And then finally, we really appreciate your feedback. It helps us shape future webinars and respond to your needs. So please fill out the survey afterward. We'd really appreciate it. A little about CCLR for those who may not know us. We are a technical assistance provider to communities working on land reuse and brownfields redevelopment issues. We provide workshops, webinars, we do policy and research, one-on-one technical assistance. We are a grantee of the EPA under their Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities, or TAB program. We have a rich assortment of resources online at cclr.org, including recordings of past webinars, soon to include this webinar. So if you have questions about brownfields redevelopment, please give us a call. We'd like to know a little bit about you, so I'm going to ask to launch a poll here. We'd like to know, how many years have you worked in the field of land reuse? We're going to give it a couple seconds for the numbers to come in. But it looks like we have a majority of attendees, about north of 60%, with less than 5 years of experience, and then 8% of you with more than 20 years of experience, and the rest in between. All right, second question. We'd like to know, where are you calling from? Are you on the East Coast? Are you on the West Coast? Are you calling from the Midwest? We'll give a couple more seconds for all this to roll in. It looks like we've got a pretty even split. The Midwest has the bulk of participants, 30% from the West Coast and 21% from the East Coast. Thank you very much. I would, moving onward, would just like to remind you that you can follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, so you can get the latest news there. And now I'm so pleased to introduce today's speakers. So we have three fabulous Detroiters with us, and we are really excited to hear about the stories that they're going to tell us about the latest in Detroit's economic rebound. First, Brian Vosburg has worked for the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation since 2015. He is the Brownfields Redevelopment Manager for the city of Detroit. So he leads underwriting, approval, the process of moving new projects into requesting a brownfield TIF, and he manages the city's existing portfolio of brownfield plans. So Brian is the city's brownfield expert. Welcome to Brian. Next up, we have Wolney, who's Vice President of Investment and Finance at Bedrock. He's responsible for managing the investment and finance aspects of current and prospective real estate projects. You're going to hear a little bit more about Bedrock early on in the presentation. RJ comes to us with over 15 years of experience working with publicly and privately held businesses in a variety of areas related to development. And then last but not least is Jared Fleisher, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs for Quicken Loans and the Quicken family of companies. He focuses on policies and initiatives that support economic development in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. He's been integrally involved in the development of the My Thrive legislation, which created the new innovative tax increment financing mechanism that we're going to hear about today. And he's played additional roles in successful legislative efforts to unlock federal funding for blight remediation in Detroit and cities across the U.S. So a really excellent panel of speakers. We're very excited to hear what they have to say. For the benefit of our speakers and for us, we'd like to ask you a couple more questions. So have you ever used the TIF mechanism in a project? Yes, no, or maybe so. Looks like, as the numbers roll in, that about 30% of you have and about 70% of you have not. Great, thank you for answering that. Last question. How current is your knowledge of Detroit's economic revitalization? Give this a couple more seconds to roll in. Okay. It looks like the bulk of you say that you know some things, you're familiar with parts of the story. We've got about 11% of you who are avid Detroit watchers, and 25% of you say that you might be able to find Detroit on a map. By the time that this webinar is over, not only will you be able to find Detroit on a map, but you'll know the latest stories from the front lines of redevelopment. All right, with that, I'd like to hand things over to Brian Vosburg, who is going to kick things off and walk us through this transformational tale of brownfield redevelopment in Detroit. Brian, take it away.
All right, thank you. So I wanted to kind of set up this this series of projects that we're going to talk about today by explaining how we got to where we are today. In Detroit and in the state of Michigan, we've lacked the economic development incentives that were large enough to make it possible for large-scale rehabilitation or new construction projects to happen, and projects that are on a catalyzing level. We've had a number of buildings in the downtown that are key projects downtown. One of them is the Hudson's Block, as we called it. It was the main department store downtown, and that sat vacant for over 30 years, and literally in the heart of the downtown. Also, one of the projects talked about today is the Book Building. It's just a grand dame of the downtown skyscrapers, and that sat vacant for over 20 years, and it's visible from most of the metro area, and it had these key properties sitting there vacant for decades. And we had several developers with very serious pedigrees come and try and redevelop these properties over the years. But unfortunately, there was nothing available as far as economic development incentives and financing and all the tools that you use to make these projects happen. And so no one was able to get to the starting line on these projects. And in Detroit and in the state of Michigan, one of the main tax incentives that we use is tax increment financing. We've been using it for over 40 years very successfully to do a number of small, medium, and large-scale projects. But again, it lacked the heft that was needed to get these large catalyzing projects over the starting line. And that's where this My Thrive legislation that Jared was instrumental in working on helped create what we call now transformational brownfield projects. And so with this big tax incentive that we talked about, which we will get into the details of, this then created what was needed to catalyze a number of projects. This is the first one to get across the starting line. There's a number coming down the pipe here. And this program uses TIF, but it's a supersized TIF. And along with that, there's a very significant underwriting process that the city goes through and that the state goes through to make sure that these projects are getting only the incentive that they need. We're not overly enriching developers on this. And there's also a very significant and very robust public participation process that is part of this TIF. And so we will also get into those aspects, and we can also answer questions about those later on if you have additional questions. And so with that kind of overview of why we feel this is significant and worth talking about, I will turn it over to RJ and Jared to kind of frame the projects that make up this project, and then we can get into some of the nuts and bolts later on in the presentation of how this new supersized TIF helps make these projects happen.
Great, thank you, Brian. So this is RJ Wolney. We're very proud to be able to speak on behalf of all that we're doing here in Detroit for Bedrock, but really for the city, the region, and the state of Michigan as well. And so with that, I just want to give a little bit of background and context on Bedrock and our activity here in the Detroit area, which really will inform and better explain, I think, when Brian used the term catalytic development, but when we talk about why this tool was created and the scale of the impact that these projects will have, I think that context will be helpful. So I should have control here to be able to flip. Yep. So Bedrock is a full-service real estate firm. We encompass really an entire range of activities from acquisition, development, construction, architecture and design, investment and finance, all the way through lease up and property management. That, of course, is taking into account the activity within the projects or buildings themselves, but we're very active as well in activating the public spaces at the base of our buildings or in the public parks, working in partnership with our friends at the city here, as far as activating those public spaces, tying everything together. We believe strongly in creating this much larger ecosystem that creates an environment where people want to come, and we use terms sort of live, work, play, et cetera. Big believers in that, and so certainly we're investing heavily in the buildings themselves, but also the spaces around them. So with that, our mission is really transforming urban cores by creating unique experiences through real estate. And while that is a noble goal that we certainly work towards every day, again, as we get into these large transformational projects, you'll see what that means as we continue to scale up. To date, since 2011, we have invested $3.5 billion in Detroit and Cleveland. We have over 100 properties. A good majority of that is in downtown Detroit's Central Business District, which is, for all intents and purposes, roughly a 1 square mile area, as well as some buildings in immediately adjacent areas to the Central Business District, as well as a presence, although it's smaller, still significant in Cleveland. That encompasses more than 17 million square feet of real estate. And yeah, again, our growth in Cleveland is following our passion here in Detroit. We have over 500 commercial and office tenants in Detroit Central Business District. And just to put that into scale, for those of you that answered to the survey, you would not be able to find necessarily Detroit on a map. Hopefully this helps. So there in the state of Michigan, kind of the southeast region, our activity, if you were to zoom in and greater downtown Detroit in the upper right-hand corner, and then ultimately into the Central Business District, which is right along the Detroit River, looking actually due south at our friends in Canada, Windsor, Canada. From that, we have roughly a little over 150,000 daytime working population in downtown Detroit. Those numbers are ticking up pretty significantly, so I always place a big asterisk next to those types of stats because, again, the amount of employers that are coming down here and folks that are working and living here every day is increasing pretty dramatically. We already have a very strong business community here in downtown and the Detroit region. We have 11 Fortune 500 companies and a significant scale of private and public enterprises also. Our strategy at Bedrock, really putting that urban core revitalization into practice, is one of combining people in place, or embracing people in place together to deliver across basically workforce need or office space, retail, restaurants and hospitality, residential living opportunities, public parks, as I mentioned, and then mobility strategies, tying it all together. So early on, our investment and activity was very focused on delivering and rehabbing these beautiful historic buildings for commercial office space and first floor retail activation, really creating an environment that would attract human capital here, and that human capital and the quality of that human capital would then cause further, I'd say, office or employer tenants to be attracted here to downtown Detroit. So it's been a very human capital led hypothesis or thesis and strategy, which is played out pretty effectively. And so our activity now going forward, certainly continuing in the office and the retail realm, but adding significant residential to that portfolio as well, given the interest and the demand to live in downtown. So from there, we have accomplished a lot in a very short period of time. Again, we began our efforts here in 2011, and quickly we've received a number of accolades. This one in particular, a quote from the New York Times from 2017, that Detroit's the most exciting city in America. Certainly we think so, but it's great to hear others, echoing the same. And the level of interest from so I'll say the business world through the culinary scene and art scene and everywhere in between is again very encouraging. So again, our approach is creating this place for people, be them office workers, be them residents, and giving them all the types of amenities and exciting things to do that will cause them to want to spend not just an 8-hour workday here perhaps, but instead an 18 or even better a 24-hour experience here in downtown. So again, like I said, we started. I said 2011 for Bedrock. That was preceded really by Dan Gilbert choosing to relocate Quicken Loans to downtown Detroit. It was initially leasing 4 office floors here in one of the buildings that we now own. Originally it was like 1,700 employees. We now have over 17,000 team members here in downtown Detroit across a portfolio of roughly 100 businesses that populate our downtown. And yet at the same time, our family of companies only accounts for roughly 30% or a little bit less of the occupancy in our, again, 100 buildings here in downtown Detroit. So we've made pretty significant efforts, but we have a mortgage vertical in Quicken Loans, but many other, I'll say, sports, entertainment, and technology type of enterprises here, drawing in talent and interest across business sector. We already, given our activity here, have I would say hit the radar screen or shown the ability to develop walkable urban environment here that is leading relative to our peers across the country. So when you look at the amount of walkable urban development that is taking place here in downtown Detroit and really in the Detroit region, we are extremely competitive as compared to even New York, Boston, Seattle, Phoenix. This was a study done by George Washington University, gauging walkable development momentum across the country. So that was an early, certainly positive sign, and we've actually only accelerated from the time at which that stat was taken. As a result, we did have George Washington University and Brookings Institute in partnership look at what our investment down here has meant. And I include this here because as we now get into what transformational and catalytic development means, it's important to point out, the idea of a transformational catalytic development is that by its presence, by dropping that development into the geographic context in which it will sit, that it creates massive net positive impact to the area around it, to the other projects or developments or buildings around it. And so it was important here as we were going about the legislative effort, which Jared will speak to in a minute. One very, I guess, great thing we had to be able to point to is we didn't have to guess as to what catalytic might mean. We had already been doing it to some extent for 5 years or more. In the fact that we've invested $3.5 billion in real estate, but really the economic input into our geography here has been closer to the tune of $8 billion to date, and it created nearly an $18 billion statewide economic impact. When you think of again, business activity generated, employee jobs created, people attracted here to live here. So that has been both the investing of dollars that has caused that, a competitive environment that has caused wage increases and accretive impact to people's disposable income, and all of that for the purpose really of attracting talent and knowledge, which as you look at sort of development of knowledge economy across this country, incredibly important for this region and state to be competitive, and that was really one of the base premises under which we pursued this effort. So with that, I will just give a quick overview on the 4 projects that we applied this tool to, and then I'll let Jared speak a bit to the effort that went about sort of the creation of the tool. So our approach here was we had 4 massive projects. Brian mentioned them at the top of the remarks here. The former Hudson's department store site sat vacant for decades. The Monroe Block site, which is currently a surface lot in the middle of our downtown, surface parking lot in the middle of our downtown. The Book Tower, which again has sat vacant for a number of decades. Beautiful historic building in terrible disrepair. And then an addition to an existing building, which I'll talk about why that's included here in a moment. But really, all these 4 projects together in combination, really important to move the needle as far as, again, delivering that type of environment that's going to continue to attract human capital here, businesses here, commerce here, give a level of quality to attract national retailers, which had been absent from our downtown for quite some time, other large-scale companies, again, to continue to drive employment growth, and of course, most importantly, all those things coming together and for a continued flow of high-quality human capital talent to be present here. And Detroit, Michigan, generally speaking, and Detroit certainly specifically, needed all these things to be happening now, given the interest and the activity here. And as Brian had mentioned, we didn't have development incentives to be able to get projects of this scale that would create this scale of an impact across the starting line. So from that, just to put these in context, like I mentioned, where our activity is primarily in the central business district, you'll see Woodward Avenue going up and down the middle of the screen here. That's sort of the main thoroughfare backbone of our downtown, and certainly our central business district. These 4 projects, all in very direct, I'd say, adjacency to one another or close geographic footprint. And that also plays a role in how we package these together. These 4 projects in total, a pretty massive undertaking. They represent over $2 billion of investment. They cover 5.6 acres, 3.2 million square feet of built environment, I guess. Over 5 years, about 5 years of construction activity, so both spending, job creation, et cetera, and delivering a significant amount of residential units, parking spaces, public space, and first floor retail activation. What does the community get out of this? This will result, again, over $2 billion in direct spending, 15,000 construction jobs, $3 billion in economic output. And then on an ongoing basis, after those projects are delivered, it's over $14 million in new annual tax income revenue for the city, at least 2,300 new residents and 9,000 permanent jobs given these 4 projects. And again, we're only talking about what happens within really the footprint of these projects, which again is an important premise for the way the tool works. So when you put that all together, again, a massive undertaking across these 4. I won't go through the details again, but more than a couple of projects of massive scale coming together here to deliver a sort of big bang catalytic and transformational impact. Just to give a quick preview of kind of the quality and environment that these 4 projects are living. This is the Monroe Blocks development. This is the central courtyard. You see a large-scale office tower kind of off to the right, residential building off to the left, first floor retail around this courtyard. And again, this type of public space, we have been very active in delivering program public space in other parts of downtown, and people have gotten so accustomed to using them that they're pretty full on a pretty regular basis. So certainly in demand for more. This is a view of the Hudson's building. Again, was at one time one of the largest department stores in the country. That has a site that has sat vacant for decades. The building here in front of you, this closest to is what we call the block building that has office on the top, an events center in the middle, and retail on the first floor. And then a little bit further in the picture, that tower building sits on an exhibition space podium and is an 800-foot tower, which would make it the tallest building in between New York and Chicago, and the tallest building in the state of Michigan. It will deliver a significant number of residential units. And then from there, the book tower, Brian talked a bit about this in his opening remarks. Incredible architecture of historic building here. You can see it sort of overlooking a good portion of the downtown here. Massive restoration effort. We've got over 2,200 windows. We've got like years of just literally restoring windows here and cleanup. You see some of the condition of the building in some lower pictures. I think this picture is sort of the perfect example of the scale of cleanup and improvement we're talking about. On the right-hand side, obviously, unclean. The left-hand side being cleaned. Some of these, it's as much an art restoration project as it is a building restoration project. We've had to recreate or remake some of these types of, these are caryatids, which we've had to remake. But really exciting project. And then lastly, I mentioned this is an addition on an existing building, and we are delivering a significant amount of additional office space in this package of 4 projects. And obviously the business activity, the tax generation activity that occurs in locating other large employers here downtown, can't go understated. But the time to which to sort of deliver that space to attract those employers here is critical. So our leasing pipeline continues to express to us the demand for larger employers to be here, and frankly, we're out of office space in downtown Detroit, and so this is over 300,000 square feet of office space addition that can come online over the course of, let's say, less than 2 years, as opposed to the 4+ years that it will take for the other ground-up developments in this package of projects to be delivered and come online. So keeping pace with the interest in being here is as important as the scale at which we deliver against the demand that the market is expressing. The last thing we want to do is sort of miss the window of people being excited and interested in being here, and again, being able to deliver at a level of scale that meets or exceeds their needs. So from there, let's see, I think I lost the control here for a moment. Bear with me. There we go. So last thing to mention, and while the rest of this presentation is I will say is very optimistic and uplifting, for sake of putting the incentives that we are primarily here to discuss in context, that large-scale development and the quality of the developments that we're talking about delivering here to be competitive at a national scale, which is what we are trying to do, what the state of Michigan is trying to do. What you see here is so Class A CBD rents on the top half of the page. Detroit is far off on the very left-hand side in the low to mid 20s as far as gross office rents. Less than half of the average of the other large, let's call it metro markets. Similarly, from a cap rate or sale price perspective, there's a lot of value creation potentially to happen here, but we're far off the mark from our peers. So when you look at construction costs, which are it doesn't cost any less to build a high-rise here in Michigan or in Detroit than it does in Chicago or elsewhere. Construction costs are the same. Rents are very different. It's not hard to do the math or the calculus as to the difficulty in delivering underwritable projects. We are fortunate to be executing against an investment vision that Dan Gilbert has that's playing out for the very long term. So taking perhaps some undue equity, or let's say irregular equity risk to be able to help support this market and deliver what we believe will be and is an incredible place to locate a business and work and live. Again, this slide really expressing the need for the financial incentive to help get projects off the starting line, which, as Brian had mentioned, is extremely difficult. So with that, I am going to pause And I'll give it over to Jared here to speak about kind of the legislative effort and the creation of the tool itself before handing it over to Brian.
Perfect. Thank you, RJ. So I'll just make 3 points about how we were able to come together and get this legislation passed. But first, just a bit of context on the political or the legislative environment. So Michigan is a state that has been schizophrenic on incentives. And we walked into an environment at a time when really there was a lot of opposition to economic development incentives in Michigan. In 2011, there was tax reform legislation passed that eliminated a lot of the tools that were in existence. And then, we were kind of at the ground zero, if you will, of the recession in 2008. It hit the automobile industry very, very hard, and the state, to help the automobile industry get through it, offered very substantial incentives. And then around 2016, when the auto industry was roaring back, those checks ended up being cashed and blowing a hole in the state budget. The point being, it was a really adverse environment for economic development incentives. On the other hand, we had Detroit at this inflection point, and willing investors like Dan, where if we could put this kind of mechanism or partnership in place, we could really take the city to the next level and do something historic, do something transformational. So how do we get it done? 3 principles, really. The first one is that this was fundamentally a statewide coalition that came together. Legislators from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 500-600 miles from Detroit, would not have an interest in something in the central business district of Detroit and nothing more than that. So we built a statewide coalition that truly, brought together all corners of the state, and that was essential. How were we able to do that? We looked at a number of different ways to structure this legislation. Should it be a downtown development piece of legislation? Should it be a major urban center piece of legislation? And what we came upon after talking to folks across the state is really the true commonality that we all had was brownfield redevelopment, or the need to do creative land recycling to get a good plug in here. And that's because, especially in a deindustrialized, state like Michigan, we have abandoned, commercial sites, things like that. Well, in the old, cities by the river, you have abandoned mills, you have abandoned, factories, foundries, all of that. And we found that literally every community that we engaged with could point to that. Oh yeah, we have this old factory, this eyesore that's in the heart of our town, and God, would we love to bring that back, that hulking, blighted factory, and geez, what that would mean for our community. But it was those biggest ones, the most challenging ones, that could never get done. And that therefore became the basis for our coalition. And the third point was to make it good public policy. And that, came around to create a lot of challenges for us, rightfully, as we were moving through the process. But there was a lot of rigor in this. And it's a good transition to Brian. We had to look legislators in the eye that were skeptical of this and really be able to say a couple things. And one of them was the mechanism of tax increment financing itself is the right way to go, because nobody's writing you a check, nobody's giving you a grant. It's basically gain sharing to make everybody better off, right? You put up the capital up front, you build it, it generates all this new revenue, and if you can just capture a piece of that new revenue, to have made all of this possible, then everybody is better off. And the other key policy points, and Brian will get into this in more detail, were just the rigor of the process, that you had to truly prove that you needed this, and you had to truly prove that this would be something that was positive for the state. So my point earlier about, everybody winning couldn't just be happy talk. It had to be something that was really proved out through real analysis, through real oversight. And then obviously it had to be something that was truly transformational, right? If a state that's skeptical about incentives is going to get back into it, We want to do it on the things that are really going to be, the most impactful, are going to have ripple effects, are going to achieve strategic objectives in terms of talent attraction, or bringing back, growing your community, attracting young people, all that. So that was really, those are kind of the magic bullets, if you will, as to how we got this done. And that's a good transition to Brian to take you through how that was translated into specific mechanics and workings of this legislation.
Thank you, Jared. Yeah, so to talk about the mechanics here, because I know that there's a lot of practitioners here who, there's the political realities that we have to work in, as Jared had talked about, but then there's also the nuts and bolts of how does this work. And for those of you that are not familiar with TIF, I know that there was a significant portion that either never worked with a TIF project, which I would assume some of those may not be that familiar with TIF. I would encourage you to look that up. There's if you just research tax increment financing online, you can find several good explanations of how that works. It's used across the country, various iterations across states and cities, but as a whole, it all works fairly the same. And so this My Thrive legislation, which created the transformational brownfield plans, it built on the current Brownfield Tax Increment Financing Act that we have, Public Act 381 of 1996, and that, again, it's been around for a little over 20 years, and it just created modifications to that. So this was not a brand new program, it's just an amendment to an existing program. Altogether, it will unlock at least $5 billion in new investment across the state. And in order to become a transformational brownfield plan, there is a minimum threshold that you have to meet for that. And the legislation created several tiers based on the size of your city. So again, getting to Jared's point of, way up in the Upper Peninsula by Lake Superior, that would be a much smaller investment, around $15 million, where in the city of Detroit, obviously, transformational project has to be much more significant than what there would be in a small town of a few thousand people. And so in Detroit, the minimum investment requirement is $500 million as a project. So if a project meets that first threshold of $500 million, then in the city of Detroit, we can talk about on the next slide. We'll kind of get into how did the Brownfield Act update that. There we go. And so you'll see in the middle here the house shape and then the graph kind of on an upward trajectory there. That is the core of the Brownfield Tax Increment program that has existed for over 20 years in the state. It's property tax capture and personal property tax capture, and a maximum of 30 years capture. So it is capped at either 30 years or upon the developer recouping all of their eligible investments, whichever comes first. And then the supersizing, if you will, that happened with this are the items on the two top items and the two bottom items. So for the life of the project, if you will, we are now able to capture personal income tax from the residents living at the project, and that's a 20-year cap. And we capture it for 50% of their income. So the state does see an increase in income tax capture. They're capturing half of it, and then the developer captures the other half. Similar to the residents living there, also the employees working in the transformational brownfield plan area there would be a 20-year capture on half of their income. And then adding another extra boost to that, at the bottom where you see the crane there, we are able to capture the personal income tax on construction labor, and that's 100% capture. So all of those thousands of workers that are going to work on this over the next 5 years, all of the state income tax, I should clarify that it's the state income tax only, would be captured and then reimbursed to the developer. And then there is an exemption from sales tax on the construction materials. So all of the steel, glass, all the drywall, all the other materials that you can think of, the billions of dollars that will go into this, those would all be exempt from the state income tax, or excuse me, state sales tax on this. And so those are the revenue streams that create the tax incentive for this project. Now, with that, then obviously, we're talking $500 million of investment or more. In the case of this project, it's over $600 million in tax increment financing from those 6 revenue streams that we just saw earlier that create the incentive for this $2 billion plus investment by Bedrock. And so obviously, with that much taxpayer dollars going into this, there has to be some public oversight into this. And so one of the great parts about this program and about using the Brownfield Authority is that requires a very robust public participation process on this. So in the City of Detroit, on that top level there, that's the City of Detroit participation process. So not necessarily every Brownfield Authority in the state of Michigan would have this level of robustness, although there is a significant public participation involved in every Brownfield Authority by state law across the state. But just to give an example of the amount of participation, there's a community benefits ordinance that was part of these projects. So Bedrock had to hold a minimum of 5 meetings with the public to generate a community benefits ordinance. And that was 5 meetings per project. Additional meetings can be added on if needed to hash out and solidify the final community benefit offer for the community. But so in the case of the Bedrock, they had to hold over a dozen community benefit ordinance meetings with downtown residents on this. Similarly with the Detroit Brownfield Redevelopment Authority, so we are the local entity that is reviewing and approving this before it goes to City Council, and we are the entity that interacts with the state on the state approval of this incentive, and we have at least 6 public meetings and public hearings that occur as part of this process, and that is in addition to the community benefits ordinance on this. As you saw, one of the buildings, the Book building and Book Tower, is a historic building that involved a review and approval by the Historic District Commission, as did some other elements of this project. And so that involved a very significant series of very detailed, very technical meetings at the city level for that. So with all of these meetings, we're talking dozens and dozens of meetings just to be able to get then to crossing the starting line for City Council. And then at City Council, there were a series of meetings for this transformational brownfield plan tax incentives, but also some of the other city approvals needed for zoning and other similar type approvals. So there were literally dozens of City Council meetings held for this, most of those having a public comment and also a public hearing as part of that. So there's a very robust process at the city level to get to the City Council approval. Then after City Council approval, they had to go to the state of Michigan for approval by the state of Michigan. And that line between City Council and the MEDC, that arrow is very short, but Jared and RJ can tell you that line is actually a very long line due to the underwriting that the state required for this project. So the city, we have a very robust underwriting process where we review and turn over every stone on this deal, review all the financials, make sure that we're not overly enriching the developer. The MEDC then went to third-party underwriting that is required by the legislation, and they had 2 different entities that reviewed the return to taxpayers. That was one aspect that was reviewed on this, and then the other aspect is the specifics of the deal. Again, how much subsidy does this project actually need? And that was very, very thorough. It was very long. lots and lots of requests for information. I know Jared and RJ were very much involved in that. So that was then all of those approvals and reviews came together then for the state level approval. And so the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and then their board, which is called the Michigan Strategic Fund, gave the final approval for this incentive. And it was a long journey to get there. I will say that. So I know in some states, TIF has become very, very controversial. In Michigan, we're quite proud of how well TIF has lasted here. It's one of the go-to tools here, and I think a large part of that is due again to what Jared had talked about, that none of the TIF comes in until the project is built and is operating successfully and operating as it was sold to the taxpayers. And then additionally, that approval process, it is just a very, very robust, very significant public participation process for that. So you can go on to the next one, RJ. And so, so for this approval process, as some of this was hinted at, it has to be declared transformational. So at the city level, we have to say that this is going to be transformational. In the case of revitalizing several, in this case, vacant parcels in the core of our downtown as well as vacant buildings, this was without a doubt transformational. And then where this would push the rents in kind of the industry standard for commercial and retail and residential property in the downtown, that was just additional transformational context for this. And then you see again the financial analysis, net benefit analysis, and then also to a significant part of this, which I know Jared can talk to, was one of the compromises that came out of this legislation getting approved, was putting caps on this. As Jared talked about, during the downturn, there was a slew of tax incentives were doled out to keep companies here, keep companies from going bankrupt and causing further, downward spiral. But when those came due, or when they were cashed in, it caused a lot of financial hardship. So there's a lot of desire to not have, an unknown liability hanging out there. And so what this MyThrive legislation does is it creates a cap. There's a $40 million annual income tax capture cap across the state of Michigan. So no project singularly or collectively can exceed that cap. And then there's a lifetime $20 million construction period sales tax benefit limit. So those are the income tax and the construction period parts are capped across the state. The property tax, because of the existing TIF program, we do not have a cap on that. That can run out the full 30 years or the reimbursement completion from the developer. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts then of how the legislation works and how the program works. And I will turn it back over to RJ and Jared to talk about how did they pull this all off.
Thanks, Brian. And as Brian mentioned, clearly this was an incredible collaborative effort here between the city and Brian's group, the state, at all levels, to create this, to bring it to a reality, and then to put it into practice. So what's represented on this last slide really is just an exhibition of, I guess, all the various work streams and efforts that came together to prove out, in some respects, I suppose, why what the program of investment that we're putting forth here would truly be as catalytic and transformational as we believe it will be, and then to help really support and communicate that underwriting, those couple underwriting processes, both from an economic impact perspective as well as a financial underwriting perspective, that these projects will benefit the state as a whole, and that they will be successful ultimately in their ultimate goals of attracting capital, employers, human capital, talent, et cetera. So we engaged a number of different groups here. So I've hit on a couple of them, but HRNA and JLL did some market research work for us that supported our underwriting. Plant Moran and Honigman helped, which is a law firm, helped with our tax capture modeling and validation of those tax capture assumptions. We have not really talked about this so far in the presentation, but in addition to the tax capture, there are also property tax abatements, and so the interplay of those two things, can get complicated relatively quickly. So, we had to be very thoughtful in how those two play together. The economic impact, I mentioned that George Washington University's and Brookings Institute's work here at sort of a high level. The Parsons Brinkerhoff, WSP Parsons Brinkerhoff also helped specifically looking at the impact of some of the projects individually. And then lastly, just the brownfield plan development itself, as far as plan drafting and identifying how each of these properties individually and then collectively were eligible under this plan. So SME is an environmental consultant, and Dykema helped them on the legal end there. And then our team here at Bedrock, pulling all of that together and in collaboration again with our friends in the public sector to put forth what was we were the first run through really of what the process would be to apply this newly created incentive. And as is always with the case with something like that, you're kind of figuring it out as you go along. So we as Brian mentioned, some of those arrows on a prior slide were perhaps longer than others, but either way, everybody worked together because everybody was collectively working in the best interest of the state and of the city. So with that, Jared, any other comments you'd like to make?
No, I think that was very thorough, and just want to make sure we leave time for any questions or comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our presenters. Really appreciate it. There's a lot to go over here. I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please enter them in the console to screen right, and we will ask them. And if we don't get to ask your question, then I encourage you to follow up afterward. Couple of questions that deal with the government's role. So I think first one up, how is, going back to the My Thrive legislation and the idea that this tax increment financing mechanism is reserved for transformational projects. Can you say a bit more about how transformational is defined, and is that criteria set at the state or the local level?
That's a really, really good question. So it's defined in two ways. There is a quantitative threshold, and that is the minimum investment requirement, and that is tailored to the size of the community. So in Detroit, it has to be at least $500 million to be transformational. In a little community up north, it can be as little as $15 million, 15. And there's actually some additional targeted exceptions in addition to that, but that's the general rule. Beyond that, the determination is really a qualitative one. The wording from the law is transformational based on its impact with respect to local economic development and community revitalization by looking at the impact on job growth, population growth, and increased commercial activity. So that is a logical standard. Really, it means how much is it going to move the economic needle. But I think the fundamental point is it's really something that is determined first and foremost at the local level. So a project has to meet the mathematical threshold, at least X amount of dollars, and then the local government has to say that it is transformational for our community because it is going to move the economic needle on those dimensions. And then that's the starting point. You have to have that to be in the game. And then the state's review is not on the qualitative side, but do you pass the statutory tests? In other words, can you prove that that you need it and that it's cost beneficial?
Excellent. Thank you so much. The questions are coming in fast and furious, so I'm going to try to get through as many of these as I can. Once the projects are done and the deferred taxes are used to finance construction, how are infrastructure systems paid for?
So actually, we left out one of the key dimensions of this, which is one of the innovations in the transformational brownfield program is the reimbursable expenses are not limited to traditional infrastructure or remediation. It's really a gap closing program, and thus all development costs are potentially eligible costs for reimbursement, with the limiting factor really being how much TIF do you need in an objective way to make the project economically viable. So, how is infrastructure financed? It can very well be part of the eligible expenses that you put forward, and then it's really up to the developer. They can either prospectively monetize the long-term tax capture by going to the bond market or a lender and saying, give me money now against this long-term repayment stream, and use that money to build the infrastructure, build the project, or and it can be a combination. You can just take the money every year as it comes in, the tax capture, and just have that be more shall I say, just part of how you service your debt, right? So not specifically monetizing the TIF, but have it being, part of the project revenue that enables you to get, your overall debt financing to make it work.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Question from Julie. What steps have you taken to minimize gentrification, for instance, to ensure mixed income residential and to provide business opportunities for small businesses?
Great question. This is the last one I'll answer. I'll turn it over to my colleagues after this, but we spent a lot of time on this. The first is the law itself actually references having to have an affordable housing strategy in place while recognizing that needs to be locally determined. And in our case, we entered into an affordable housing agreement with the city of Detroit that committed 20% of our total portfolio to be developed as affordable housing. What that means is, listen, not necessarily every building, makes sense to have 20% affordable, but we need vibrant mixed income districts. We need, the streets to be shared by folks of all income. We need diverse communities. So we took a portfolio approach that basically says of everything, in your cluster, 20% of it needs to be affordable housing at least 80% of the area median income. And with respect to the small businesses, this is another matter that actually is not specifically addressed by the legislation, but that was absolutely an imperative in terms of A, being the right thing, and B, in terms of working through the local process and getting local buy-in and support and approval. And how we specifically address that is through commitments to hire Detroit residents for the construction, and kind of a whole programmatic infrastructure that we put forward about how we're going to support small business technical assistance programs and give small businesses opportunities in our spaces, kind of a pipeline approach of helping small businesses get off the ground, putting them maybe in really, for example, public markets in our public spaces so that they can get a customer base, high exposure, and grow. And then once they're a little bit more mature, actually working with them to, lease, the first class retail space in these new developments. But long story short is both of them were either formally or as a matter of doing the right thing and getting approved, things that we absolutely engaged on and addressed.
Excellent. Thank you very much. These are some great questions. I'm going to combine two for this next one from Andrew and Jeff. First, thoughts on how to gain backing for TIF when former projects have been problematic? And second, are you aware of any other states using an expanded TIF approach to support redevelopment efforts?
We always walk in the shadows of history, right? So I think, the most important thing to do is to take it head on and differentiate and be very intentional about it, right? So we were in the shadow, as Brian explained, of these tax incentives that arguably went bad, certainly had a big cost, and we took that on, head on. It was a major challenge for us, but that's why we put in all these protections, all these caps. You want to be able to say, this is why this is different, and this is why it's needed. We've got to do it, and this is how we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the past, but rather learn from them to accomplish something very important. And then your other question, shouldn't have done two at once. My mind is not good enough to handle
I'm sorry.
this.
There's a lot in there. Other states that you're aware of that have
Gotcha.
used an expanded TIF structure?
Yeah, this one is actually unique in terms of everything that it puts together. There's about 16 states, for example, that go beyond your traditional property tax TIF. Some of them do sales tax capture. There's some other various things folks do. But really, there's no other state that has put together this combination of elements.
Great. I think we've got time for two more questions. So first, who's in charge of all the tax tracking? Does the Brownfield Authority staff administer the transformational taxes part to the for the state, or does the project developer track and submit that information to the state?
Great question. So if you don't report it, it didn't happen. So the developer is responsible for getting everything reported, and then it's really the Treasury Department of the state of Michigan that's responsible for everything except for the local property tax, which is captured as it traditionally is by the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority.
Question, and so I just want to say that if you didn't get your questions answered, please know that we will send the questions forward to the presenters. Again, we're really just pleased by the variety of questions you all have been sending, so thank you for your engagement. Final question here. Did you have to get different lenders who were comfortable with the different elements of the projected tax increment revenues, property tax, income, et cetera? And then how conservative were those lenders in terms of building risk into their interest rates?
Another really good question, RJ.
Yeah, I will. I'll speak to that and say we're working on it. So the reality is, and what is baked into that question is an acknowledgement that each form of tax capture here, each form of dollars that are ultimately coming together to make the entire package of transformational brownfield incentive have different characteristics to them and different sort of underwriting risk, I'll say. So we're in works right now addressing those very questions. So to be determined, but nonetheless, we're very encouraged by the market's interest in these projects generally and the ability to participate.
Yeah, the answers are not going to give us 100 cents on the dollar, and we're going to make the case for as much as we can, and we've baked that into our models for sure.
Excellent. Thank you so much to Brian, RJ, and Jared. This has been great. I want to just say for those who are attending, you will receive an email with a link to the recorded version of this webinar. If you want the PowerPoint, please visit our website, www.cclear.org. We'll also send around a link to the Brookings Institute paper that was mentioned earlier, so you can take a look at that. And I just want to extend a big thank you one more time to our speakers. I had the pleasure, I should have shared this earlier, but I had the pleasure in May at the Urban Land Institute spring meeting of meeting Brian. And when we started talking about all the exciting work he was doing, I said, we need to get you on a webinar. Here we are. It's been a great hour plus, and I just want to thank all of you for your time and energy and for sharing with us your story and your lessons learned about your experiences in Detroit. I hope this is a valuable opportunity for all of our listeners from around the country to catch up and hear the latest about what's going on in Motor City. So thank you again to our speakers, and thank you to all of our attendees, and we will see you next time. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.